Senator John Whelan. Okay, you have 4 minutes, Senator.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I'd like to welcome Minister Anne Phelan to the House, my colleague. And while the question was directed to the Minister for Health, it's not at all inappropriate that it's been taken on his behalf today by Minister Anne Phelan because of a responsibility remit that she has, particularly with regard to rural development and rural areas. Because, Minister, while it's not directly under the aegis of your department, one of the latest and newest challenges facing rural Ireland is for rural communities, towns and villages to retain their GP services. Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon, and due to the retirement of incumbents and long-serving GPs across the country, it's my information that the HSE are experiencing chronic difficulty in between 30 and 40 towns and villages across Ireland, in all different regions across the country, in filling vacancies where GPs have retired. This in itself reflects, I think, a change of emphasis from where, perhaps we see manifest in other areas as well, where a GP practice is not necessarily any longer just a vocationary pursuit, but in fact it's viewed as a career, and it must stack up as a business, it must stack up as a sustainable proposition, it must be viable, and it must meet the demands and, I suppose, expectations of people's and families' lifestyle expectations these days. I particularly put the question, Minister, due to the ongoing anxiety and indeed, alarm that was developing in my own county of County Laois due to the ongoing process and the length of time it was taking to find a GP replacement for the village of Borris-in-Ossory. The incumbent, a long-serving practitioner who's given sterling, loyal and committed, dedicated service, Dr. Seamus Fitzgerald, is retiring of his own volition, and I wish him a happy, healthy and lengthy retirement. However, the process to replace him was commenced as far back as last November. And while I understand and I'm heartened that there were a number of expressions of interest, indeed perhaps maybe 4 qualified candidates interviewed for the post to take up and replace the incumbent, Dr. Fitzgerald, the vacancy looms large within a week's time, at the end of March, Minister, and I'm hoping that you have a positive reply from here today that the Borris-in-Ossory vacancy has been resolved and has been successfully addressed by the HSE. But in that context, there is a bigger and a wider issue that needs to be considered by the Minister for Health, that when he's negotiating the GP contract with the GPs and the IMO, there is now a new trend developing where new doctors and younger practitioners are no longer willing to embrace general practices in smaller towns and villages across rural Ireland. As I said, up to 40 vacancies exist at the moment. And this, I think, is going to accelerate unless it's addressed. And it needs to be addressed, Cathaoirleach, with respect by ensuring that the rural practice allowance is restored and is sufficient to make the practice attractive and viable and feasible and sustainable, and also that the terms and conditions being sought of the GPs, such as the rents being sought for them for the clinics that they use in these towns and villages, like towns and villages like Borris-in-Ossory, are not as lucrative as larger urban areas in the city of Dublin and so on. And it's my understanding that the HSE are looking for the extortionate price of €25 per square metre for the rent from the new GP for the practice, for the clinic in Borris-in-Ossory. And I think that's a punitive price to seek. It's not consistent with the current market value, and I think it puts a great strain on any doctor trying to come in and fulfil a dedicated and committed service in an area like Borris-in-Ossory and its extensive hinterland. Thank you, Minister.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator, and I'm taking this adjournment debate, commencement debate on behalf of the Minister, and you raise an extremely important issue, and with my own role as Rural Affairs Minister, yes, I can see why there would be very grave concerns in rural parts of Ireland where these situations may arise. The HSE is committed to the provision of quality general practitioner services through the General Medical Service GP contract. GMS GP posts are filled in line with the HSE's Human Resources Recruitment Guidelines. periodically challenges can be experienced in relation to the permanent filling of GP posts. In areas where this challenge is experienced, every effort is made by the local HSE management to ensure the provision of GP services to all GMS patients. The retiring doctor in Borris-in-Ossory advised the HSE of his intention to resign from the GMS scheme in November 2014. The GP's practice is a single-handed rural practice with a GMS panel size of approximately 830 patients. The GMS panel was advertised by open competition and interviews took place in late 2014. 2 applicants applied and both were placed on a panel following successful interview. Both candidates successfully declined the offer of the position. The position was subsequently re-advertised by open competition in early February 2015, and interviews took place in the first week of March 2015. The HSE has been engaging systematically with 2 successful candidates based on their panel position, and I am happy to state that the first place candidate has accepted the position and will commence work as soon as possible. I know that the Senator will welcome that news. While GP numbers are keeping pace with overall demographics, this does not always prevent shortages occurring at local level. GPs, once qualified, tend to work for existing GP practices or as self-employed contractors and are free to decide where to establish their practice. Isolated rural areas and deprived urban areas, very often with limited private practice opportunities, may sometimes find it difficult to attract GPs to fill the vacant posts. Indeed, the Senator pointed out that himself. The HSE is actively seeking to address this issue at present with the medical organisations with a view to developing practical measures, including reorganising lists with existing doctors in local areas and through the adoption of a more flexible contractual arrangement which would encourage young GPs to work in such areas. The Department of Health and the HSE are currently in discussions with the IMO about the introduction of flexible or shared GMS contracts. The possibility of extending the current GMS GP retirement age from 70 to 72 years is also being considered. The introduction of shared GMS contracts would provide more family-friendly working arrangements better suited to the increasing number of female GPs, thus making it more attractive to pursue working in the GMS scheme. Under the programme for government, it is intended to develop a new contractual framework for GPs which will be more suited to current needs and will facilitate the planned development of primary care services. Substantive discussions on a new GMS contract will commence shortly with the Irish Medical Organisation. Mechanisms for encouraging GPs to set up practices in rural and urban disadvantaged areas will be considered as appropriate in the context of these discussions. In the meantime, where GMS GP vacancies arise in an area, the HSE will take the necessary steps to ensure that the continuity of service to GMS patients is maintained. Thank you.
Is there a satisfactory response, Senator?
With your permission, a brief supplementary.
Oh yes, I will allow you, yeah.
Thank you. And I do want to acknowledge and thank the Minister for a positive and constructive response. And it is indeed heartening and positive news for the people of Borris-in-Ossory and surrounding areas that the HSE have successfully managed to secure a replacement and that a new GP will take up duty in Borris-in-Ossory imminently, and I welcome that. However, I think that they would find that it would be easier to recruit GPs to rural areas and other communities where it's not as attractive to set up a new practice if I think their own criteria were more favourable and more supportive of young GPs. And I think the rural practice allowance for GPs needs to be reviewed, it needs to be revised, and it needs to be reintroduced in areas where it has been withdrawn, such as in Borris-in-Ossory. I think it's scandalous that it has been withdrawn in this instance and in others where I think it would help make the practice more viable, attractive and sustainable. And Minister, in your own offices as Minister with responsibility for rural affairs and rural development, I believe you have an important role to play here, because I think one of the cornerstones of any viability of any village and rural area would be to have a GP practice so that families can feel secure and safe that they have the recourse to such a service. And without it, it does undermine the sustainability of a rural community. So therefore, I ask you to lend your voice and your support to this issue, because I think some of the criteria currently being applied by the HSE to such practices as in Borris-in-Ossory, as I said, I think it's a punitive rent they are seeking for the use of the HSE facilities and clinic in Borris-in-Ossory. €25 per square metre, that's prime real estate prices. We're not in Dublin, and not everywhere is buzzing and is thriving as the capital, and is not as prosperous. And I think there's a strong case to be made for the HSE in this instance, and in other instances indeed, to waive the rental cost, at least initially in the first few years, so as the practice can get established and take root, and so as that we can have a committed, dedicated and viable practice for the people in communities such as Borris-in-Ossory. And I do think the HSE, need to make a better effort and need to review the criteria which they're applying promptly. And that I'm glad to hear that it is part of an overall review. But time is of the essence, Minister, and I believe that you and the Government, and indeed the Minister for Health, are going to face an ongoing challenge across the regions in rural Ireland to fill vacancies as they arise for new GPs. Thank you.